James Mitchell stood at the entrance of the Blackwater shooting range, his civilian clothes making him look ordinary among the crowd of weekend warriors. At 32, he had the quiet presence of someone who preferred listening to talking. His brown hair was neatly trimmed, and his brown eyes held a calmness that most people mistook for shyness. The shooting range buzzed with activity on this Saturday afternoon. Men in expensive tactical gear strutted around, showing off their latest rifle purchases and bragging about their shooting groups. The air smelled of gunpowder and machismo. James approached the counter where a burly man named Rick handled rentals and lane assignments. Rick looked him up and down, taking in James's simple jeans and plain t-shirt. "First time here, buddy?" Rick asked with a smirk. "You look a little lost." "Just need a lane and some targets," James replied quietly. Rick chuckled and turned to his regular customers who were gathered nearby. "Hey guys, we got ourselves a newbie. Probably thinks he's gonna be the next action hero." The group laughed loudly. There was Brad, a car salesman who spent more on gear than most people made in a month. Next to him stood Mike, a former security guard who never stopped talking about his tactical experience. The third was Tony, a gym owner who believed his muscles made him naturally gifted with firearms. "What you planning to shoot there, champ?" Brad called out, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "Hope you brought some training wheels." James simply nodded toward the rental counter. "Just a standard rifle will do." This brought another round of laughter from the trio. Mike stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "Brother, you can't just walk in here and expect to hit anything. This ain't like the movies. Takes years to develop real shooting skills." Rick handed James a basic hunting rifle and pointed toward lane 15, the farthest one from the group. "There you go, sport. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." As James walked toward his assigned lane, he could hear the whispered comments behind him. The regular customers had formed their own little audience, curious to see how badly the quiet newcomer would perform. The shooting range had 20 lanes, each separated by concrete dividers. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the space. The constant pop of gunfire echoed through the building, mixed with the occasional whoop of celebration when someone hit their target. James set up at his lane methodically. He checked the rifle, examined the scope, and loaded his first magazine with careful precision. His movements were smooth and practiced, but none of the watching group noticed these details. $10 says he can't hit the broadside of a barn," Brad whispered loudly enough for James to hear. "Make it 20, Tony added. "Look at how he's holding that thing. Probably thinks it's a hunting trip." James adjusted his position, settling into a comfortable stance. He raised the rifle and peered through the scope at the target 100 yards down range. The standard bullseye target looked small through the magnification. But James's breathing remained steady and controlled. The first shot rang out, and the spotting scope showed a hole near the outer ring of the target. The watching group erupted in laughter. "Told you so," Mike called out. "Barely on the paper." James said nothing. He adjusted his position slightly and fired again. This shot landed closer to the center, but still outside the main scoring rings. More chuckles and comments followed. "Maybe we should call an instructor over," Rick suggested mockingly. "Get you some professional help." What the group didn't realize was that James was doing something they never bothered with during their own shooting sessions. He was studying the rifle, learning its particular quirks and characteristics. Every gun shoots differently, and James was methodically figuring out this weapon's personality. The third shot hit the 7 ring, much closer to center. The laughter died down slightly, but the comments continued. "Lucky shot," Brad muttered. James continued firing, his shots gradually walking toward the center of the target. By the time he finished his first magazine, he had established a decent group near the bullseye. Not perfect, but respectable for someone supposedly shooting for the first time. "Not bad for a beginner," Tony admitted grudgingly. "Still got a long way to go, though." James reloaded and continued shooting. His second magazine showed marked improvement. The shots were tighter, more consistent. A few even hit the 10 ring. The group of regulars began to pay closer attention. Their casual dismissal was slowly turning into curiosity. This quiet man wasn't shooting like a complete amateur anymore. "Must have done some hunting," Mike suggested, trying to explain the improvement. "Probably shoots deer or something." James finished his second magazine and set the rifle down. He walked over to check his target, and the group followed at a distance. The paper showed a clear progression from scattered shots to a tight group centered on the bullseye. "Well, I'll be damned," Rick muttered. "That's not bad shooting for someone who just wandered in off the street." But James wasn't done. He returned to his lane and loaded a third magazine. This time something had changed in his posture. He seemed more relaxed, more confident. His breathing pattern was different, more controlled. The first shot from the third magazine hit dead center in the 10 ring. The second shot followed it almost exactly. By the fifth shot, the watching group had gone completely quiet. James was no longer shooting like a beginner. His technique was flawless, his control absolute. Each shot landed with mechanical precision in the same small area of the target's center. The transformation was so dramatic that other shooters on nearby lanes began to notice. Word spread quietly through the range that someone was putting on a shooting clinic at lane 15. "Who is this guy?" someone whispered. James continued shooting with the same calm demeanor he had maintained since walking through the door. But now, instead of scattered shots and nervous adjustments, every squeeze of the trigger produced another perfect hole in the center of his target. The group that had been mocking him just minutes earlier stood in stunned silence, watching a display of marksmanship that few of them had ever witnessed in person. The silence stretched for several long seconds as James finished his third magazine. Every shot had found the center of the target with machine-like precision. The group of regulars exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Rick was the first to break the spell. He cleared his throat and walked closer to James's lane, his swagger noticeably reduced. "That's some fine shooting there, friend. Where'd you learn to handle a rifle like that?" James shrugged casually as he set the weapon down. "Here and there." The non-answer only deepened the mystery. Brad, who had been so quick with his jokes earlier, now approached with obvious respect. "Seriously, man, that's professional-level accuracy. You compete or something?" "Not really," James replied, his voice still carrying that same quiet tone. Mike stepped forward, his tactical vest suddenly looking ridiculous compared to James's simple attire. "Come on, nobody shoots like that without serious training. Military? Police?" James began cleaning the rifle with practiced efficiency, his movements suggesting years of familiarity with firearms maintenance. "I work security," he said simply. This partial truth satisfied no one. Security guards didn't typically demonstrate the kind of precision shooting they had just witnessed. The gathered crowd grew larger as word spread through the range about the mysterious marksman at lane 15. Tony, the gym owner, had been studying James's technique throughout the shooting session. "Your stance, your breathing, the way you work that bolt action, that's not civilian training. I've seen military guys shoot, and you're better than most of them." James finished cleaning the rifle and handed it back to Rick. "Thanks for the lane rental." But Rick waved off the dismissal. "Hold on there, partner. How about you show us what you can really do? I mean, that was impressive shooting, but you were taking your time, being all methodical. What if we made it interesting?" The crowd murmured approval. Other shooters had abandoned their own practice to watch this unfolding drama. James looked around at the expectant faces, considering the request. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Rick's eyes lit up with the prospect of a real show. "We got some challenging targets in the back room. Different distances, moving targets, precision challenges. Most guys can't handle them, but someone with your skills—" "I'd like to see that," called out a voice from the crowd. An older man stepped forward wearing a veteran's cap. "Name's Frank. Served 20 years in the Marines. Haven't seen shooting like that since my sniper training days." James studied the veteran for a moment. Something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that only those with similar backgrounds would understand. "What kind of challenges?" James asked. Rick's grin widened. "Well, we got targets at 300 yards, some pop-up scenarios, maybe some precision work on smaller targets. Of course, most folks can't handle that kind of difficulty." The crowd pressed closer, sensing something special was about to happen. James looked around at their eager faces, then back at the veteran who continued to study him with knowing eyes. "All right," James said quietly. "Let's see what you've got." Rick led the group toward the back of the facility, where the range extended much further than the standard lanes. This area was reserved for advanced shooters and special events. The targets here were more sophisticated, some computer-controlled, others requiring genuine skill to engage effectively. "This is where we separate the men from the boys," Rick announced dramatically. He gestured toward a series of targets positioned at varying distances. "Farthest one is at 400 yards. Most guys can't even see it clearly, let alone hit it." James accepted a different rifle this time, a more precise instrument with a better scope. He examined it carefully, checking the action, testing the trigger pull, familiarizing himself with its characteristics. "You want to take a few practice shots?" Rick offered. "No need," James replied calmly. He settled into position, but this time his stance was noticeably different. Gone was any pretense of being an amateur. His body alignment was perfect, his grip professional. The transformation was complete and obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Frank the veteran watched with increasing interest. "Son," he said quietly, "you mind if I ask what unit you served with?" James glanced at him briefly. "I didn't say I served." "You don't have to," Frank replied knowingly. "But that's not civilian shooting technique. That's advanced military training. Special forces, if I had to guess." The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people, with shooters from other lanes abandoning their practice to witness whatever was about to unfold. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. James raised the rifle and acquired the first target through his scope. It was a standard bullseye at 200 yards, well within normal shooting parameters. His first shot was dead center, as expected, but then Rick activated the challenge course. Targets began appearing at different distances and angles. Some popped up for only seconds before disappearing. Others swayed gently in simulated wind conditions. What happened next left the crowd speechless. James engaged each target with fluid precision, working through the course like someone who had done this thousands of times before. His movements were economical, professional, deadly accurate. He transitioned between targets smoothly, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. The 200-yard targets were child's play. The 300-yard shots were handled with casual confidence. When he engaged the 400-yard target, hitting it dead center on his first attempt, someone in the crowd actually gasped. But James wasn't finished. Rick activated the most challenging scenario they offered. Multiple moving targets at varying distances, all appearing and disappearing on random timers. James systematically engaged each target as it appeared. His shooting rhythm was hypnotic, each shot carefully timed and precisely placed. When the final target disappeared, he had achieved a perfect score. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't surprise anymore. It was awe. Frank stepped forward, his veteran's instincts fully engaged. "Son, I've seen a lot of fine shooting in my day, but that was something else entirely. That was professional-level marksmanship, elite level." James set the rifle down and turned to face the crowd. For the first time since arriving at the range, he seemed to be considering how much to reveal about himself. "What do you really do for work?" someone called out. James was quiet for a long moment, weighing his response. Finally, he spoke. I work for the Royal Protection Service. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical force. The Royal Protection Service, the elite unit responsible for protecting the British royal family. Suddenly, James's extraordinary shooting skills made perfect sense. "You mean you're actually a royal guard?" Brad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. All traces of his earlier mockery had vanished completely. James nodded simply. "I protect members of the royal family during public appearances and private functions." Frank, the veteran, stepped closer with obvious respect. "That explains the shooting, but not all of it. Royal protection officers are good, don't get me wrong, but what I just witnessed goes beyond standard close protection training." James studied the older man carefully. Something in Frank's bearing suggested he knew more about military operations than he was letting on. "You've got sniper training," Frank continued, his voice carrying certainty. "Advanced sniper training. The kind they don't hand out to regular protection officers." The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were about to learn something extraordinary. James remained silent for several moments, clearly debating how much to reveal. Rick, emboldened by the crowd's obvious fascination, pushed for more information. "Come on, man, you can't drop a bombshell like that and then clam up. Royal Protection Service is serious business, but Frank's right. Your shooting is on another level entirely." James looked around at the expectant faces surrounding him. These people had gone from mocking him to practically worshiping his skills in the span of an hour. The transformation was both amusing and sobering. "Before the Royal Protection Service," he said finally, "I served with the Special Air Service." The words fell into the crowd like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and amazement. The SAS, Britain's most elite special forces unit, legendary for their selection process and operational capabilities. Frank straightened to attention instinctively. "How long?" 8 years, James replied. "Sniper specialist." Mike, the former security guard who had been so quick to question James's abilities, now looked pale. "Jesus Christ, we were making fun of an SAS sniper. I feel like an idiot." "You had no way of knowing," James said without any trace of anger or resentment. "That was kind of the point." Tony wiped sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning. "What kind of missions? I mean, if you can talk about them." James's expression grew more serious. "Counter-terrorism, hostage rescue, reconnaissance operations in hostile territories, places I can't name, doing things I can't discuss." The crowd absorbed this information with a mixture of fascination and newfound respect. These weren't video game exploits or movie fantasies. They were real-world operations conducted by one of the world's most elite military units. Frank spoke up again, his military bearing evident. "Selection course?" "Passed on first attempt," James answered. "Spent 2 additional years in advanced sniper training after that." The implications of this hit the more knowledgeable members of the crowd immediately. The SAS selection course was notorious for its difficulty, with pass rates typically below 10%. Only the most exceptional candidates survived the process. Rick shook his head in amazement. "And now you protect the royal family?" "Among other duties," James confirmed. "Close protection work is actually quite different from military sniping, but the fundamental skills transfer well." Brad, who had been conspicuously quiet since the revelations began, finally found his voice. "I owe you an apology, man. We were completely out of line earlier." "No offense taken," James replied genuinely. "You couldn't have known. Most people don't expect to run into special forces operators at their local shooting range." Frank gestured toward the targets James had decimated during his demonstration. "Those shots at 400 yards, that's operational level accuracy. How far out could you effectively engage targets during your service?" James considered the question carefully. "Confirmed kills out to 800 meters. Trained for engagements beyond 1,000 meters under ideal conditions." The numbers meant little to most of the crowd. but Frank's eyebrows rose significantly. Those were distances that separated professional snipers from everyone else who carried a rifle. "Any particular theater of operations?" Frank pressed, his curiosity evident. "Afghanistan, primarily," James answered. "Some work in Iraq during the height of the insurgency. A few other places that remain classified." Mike found his voice again, but it was much more respectful now. "How many... is it okay to ask about combat experience?" James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Enough to understand the responsibility that comes with these skills. Every shot in combat carries consequences that stay with you forever." The crowd grew solemn at his words. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just talking to an impressive marksman, they were speaking with someone who had used these abilities in life-and-death situations. "Is that why you transitioned to protection work?" asked a voice from the back of the crowd. James nodded thoughtfully. "After 8 years of offensive operations, I wanted to use my training to protect rather than eliminate. The Royal Protection Service offered that opportunity." Frank stepped forward and extended his hand. "It's been an honor, son. What you've shown us today, both in skill and character, represents the best of what our military produces." James accepted the handshake with quiet dignity. "Thank you. That means something, coming from a fellow veteran." The crowd began to disperse slowly, many still shaking their heads in amazement at what they had witnessed. Conversations buzzed with excitement as people processed the extraordinary afternoon they had just experienced. But Rick held up his hand, an idea forming in his mind. "Hold on, everyone. James, would you consider coming back sometime? Maybe doing a demonstration or teaching some techniques? I think a lot of folks would benefit from learning from someone with your background." James looked around at the faces that had transformed from mockery to respect over the course of a few hours. These were good people who had simply made assumptions based on appearances, something he was used to from his years of working in plain clothes. "I might be able to arrange something," he said thoughtfully, "though I'd have to check with my superiors first." Royal protection officers aren't supposed to draw too much attention to themselves. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The quiet man they had dismissed as a weekend amateur was actually one of Britain's most elite warriors, trained to deadly perfection and trusted with protecting the nation's most important figures. 3 weeks later, James returned to the Blackwater shooting range. This time, his arrival created a very different atmosphere. Word had spread throughout the shooting community about the mysterious Royal Guard who had demonstrated extraordinary skills, and the range was busier than Rick had ever seen it. "James!" Rick called out enthusiastically as soon as he spotted him. "Welcome back, my friend. Ready for today's session?" True to his word, James had received permission from his superiors to conduct a basic marksmanship clinic. The Royal Protection Service had seen value in community outreach, particularly when it helped dispel myths about their operations and built positive relationships with civilian shooting enthusiasts. The same group that had mocked him 3 weeks earlier was present, but their demeanor was completely transformed. Brad approached with genuine respect, carrying himself with more humility than James had seen during their first encounter. "Thank you for agreeing to do this," Brad said sincerely. "I've been thinking about that day ever since. Really opened my eyes about making assumptions." Mike nodded in agreement. "I've been practicing with the techniques I remember from watching you shoot. My groupings have improved dramatically, just from copying your breathing pattern and stance." Tony had brought several friends from his gym, all eager to learn from someone with James's background. "I told them about what we witnessed, but I don't think my description did it justice. They had to see for themselves." Frank, the veteran, had also returned, bringing with him 2 other former military members. "Brought some old friends who appreciate quality marksmanship," he explained. "Hope that's okay?" James surveyed the gathered crowd of about 40 people, nearly twice the normal Saturday afternoon attendance. All eyes were focused on him with genuine respect and anticipation. "Before we begin," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the group, "I want to address something. 3 weeks ago, some of you made jokes about my appearance and assumed I was inexperienced. That's natural. We all make judgments based on limited information." He paused, making eye contact with several people in the crowd. "But that day taught all of us an important lesson about assumptions. The person standing next to you might be a combat veteran, a police officer, a medical professional, or someone with skills and experiences you can't imagine just by looking at them." Brad shifted uncomfortably but nodded in acknowledgement. "You handled our stupidity with a lot more grace than we deserved." "Everyone starts somewhere," James replied diplomatically. "The point isn't where you begin. It's whether you're willing to learn and improve." Rick had set up different stations throughout the range, each designed to teach specific aspects of marksmanship. James moved methodically through the crowd, working with individuals and small groups, sharing techniques developed through years of elite military training. At the first station, he demonstrated proper rifle handling and safety procedures. His movements were deliberate and precise, each action explained clearly for the watching crowd. "Safety isn't just about following rules," he explained while demonstrating how to properly clear a weapon. "It's about developing habits that become automatic. In combat situations, you don't have time to think about each step. Your training takes over." At the second station, James focused on fundamental shooting positions and breathing techniques. He worked individually with several shooters, making small adjustments that produced dramatic improvements in their accuracy. "Shooting isn't about strength or aggression," he told a young man struggling with his stance. "It's about control, patience, and consistency. The best snipers I knew were often the quietest, most methodical people in the unit." Frank watched from a nearby position, impressed not just with James's technical knowledge, but with his teaching ability. "You've got a gift for instruction," he observed. "Ever consider training programs after your current career?" James smiled slightly. "I enjoy teaching, but my commitment is to the Royal Protection Service for the foreseeable future. This is more of a personal interest." The third station challenged shooters with longer distance targets and precision requirements. James demonstrated the mathematical calculations involved in long-range shooting, accounting for wind, elevation, temperature, and other environmental factors. "Military sniping is as much science as art," he explained while making adjustments to a rifle scope. "You have to understand ballistics, meteorology, and physics. A single miscalculation can mean the difference between mission success and failure." Mike asked the question many were thinking: how do you handle the pressure, knowing that people's lives depend on your accuracy? James was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "Training prepares you technically, but the psychological aspect comes from understanding your purpose. In the military, you're protecting your fellow soldiers. In my current role, I'm protecting people who serve the public." That sense of mission helps maintain focus under pressure. As the afternoon progressed, James shared stories from his training, carefully avoiding classified operational details while illustrating important principles. He spoke about the grueling selection process for the SAS, the months of specialized sniper training, and the mental discipline required for elite performance. "The hardest part of sniper training wasn't the shooting," he revealed. "It was learning patience and mental control, spending hours in uncomfortable positions, waiting for the right moment, maintaining concentration despite distractions. Those skills transfer to many aspects of life." Tony asked about the transition from military to civilian protection work. "Is it difficult adapting from offensive to defensive operations?" "Different mindset entirely," James acknowledged. "Military sniping is about eliminating threats. Protection work is about preventing situations where force becomes necessary. The skills overlap, but the philosophy is completely different." By the end of the afternoon, every participant had shown measurable improvement in their shooting. More importantly, they had gained insight into the dedication and sacrifice required for elite performance in any field. As people began packing up their equipment, Frank approached James privately. "Son, what you've done today goes beyond teaching marksmanship. You've shown these folks what real professionalism looks like." James nodded appreciatively. "Everyone here has been respectful and eager to learn. It's been rewarding." Rick joined the conversation, his excitement evident. "This has been our most successful event ever. People are already asking when you might come back." "I'll see what I can arrange," James replied, "though it might be a few months before my schedule permits another session." As James prepared to leave, Brad approached one final time. "I wanted to thank you personally. Not just for the instruction, but for the lesson in humility. I've been thinking differently about people since that first day." "We all have something to learn from each other," James responded. "Today you taught me something too, that people are willing to grow when given the opportunity." Driving home that evening, James reflected on how the day had unfolded. His superiors had been pleased with the positive community engagement, and he had genuinely enjoyed sharing knowledge with enthusiastic students. More importantly, he had witnessed something that reaffirmed his faith in people's capacity for growth and change. The same individuals who had mocked him weeks earlier had approached today's session with open minds and genuine respect. His phone buzzed with a text message from Frank. "Thanks for today. Haven't seen shooting like that since my active duty days. You're an honor to the profession." James smiled as he read the message. Sometimes the most meaningful missions weren't the ones that made headlines or earned official recognition. Sometimes they were simply about showing up, sharing knowledge, and reminding people that excellence comes in many forms. The quiet royal guard who had been teased at the range had become something more: a teacher, a bridge between military and civilian communities, and a reminder that true strength often comes wrapped in humility. As he pulled into his driveway, James was already thinking about the next session Rick had mentioned. There were more lessons to share, more assumptions to challenge, and more opportunities to show that the most dangerous people are often the ones who appear most ordinary. The shooting range had taught him something valuable, too: that his skills had purpose beyond protection duties. They could inspire, educate, and bring people together in appreciation of discipline and excellence. It had been a good day,